So welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Lloyd. I am working on the Grassland 2.0 project and in the supply chain development work. And I am going to be the moderator today. So I want to kick it over to Jean Schrieffer, who is a UW Extension educator in the southwestern part of the state. And he is going to introduce our special guest speaker today. So go for it, Jean.
Sure. Thank you very much, Sarah. Jean Schrieffer, Iowa County, out in the southwest corner of the state, working with the learning hubs out here, also a grass-fed beef producer. And this afternoon, we have the privilege of hearing from Stephan van Vliet with the Duke Molecular Physiology Institute at the Duke University School of Medicine. And it was just over a year ago that Stephan had filled out an information form with the Wisconsin Meadows Grass-Fed Beef Cooperative, talking about some interesting data he was finding, comparing grass-fed beef with feedlot beef, and also plant burgers, and what the nutritional comparisons were, and how these may impact human health. And I've been following this topic for many years. Probably about 20 years ago, Wisconsin did some foundational research on CLAs. We had a researcher by the name of Thelma Heidelbaker, who moved on to Utah State to continue his work and looking at the health benefits of grass-fed over grain-fed milk and dairy and meat products. So that work is continuing. Human health research is rather slow, but it is coming along. And related to the additional excitement is generational changes. And as we look at purchasing preferences or goals of millennials, Gen Zs, and the new alpha generation, they're thinking about food as health. And here's something that potentially answers that question, where we can have a healthy environment and a healthier us, and focus on the human aspect of that. Now, you'll notice in the first slide, Duke University School of Medicine, Stephan will be leaving for Utah State, looks like starting in January. And Wisconsin missed the opportunity because he was a finalist for a position here at UW-Madison. And I got terribly excited about that opportunity that might represent for us, but he wanted to be an Aggie and not a Badger. So we're questioning your judgment, Stephan. So with that, let's welcome Stephan and listen to the data that he's able to generate regarding the linkages between human and animal and human health. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Jean, and I appreciate being here and giving me the opportunity to discuss our work. So what we're talking about today is really the linkages between animal and human health. So a lot of my research and that of my group is really at the nexus of agriculture and human health. Being in schools of medicine for the past several years, first at WashU and now at Duke, really gave me a unique insight, and I got increasingly interested in linking the fields of food production, agriculture with human health, because most of the diseases of dietary origin that we're studying in nutrition departments and in schools of medicine can be traced back to an extent to diet. So it's really the focus is building health from the ground up. And today I'll talk about meat and milk as sources of phytochemicals. Their presence remains largely underappreciated in nutritional discussions on grass-fed meat and milk, which have predominantly centered around omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid. But really the work that we've been performing and others have also performed finds that various potentially health promoting compounds are transferred from the forage into the meat and milk in animals. And I'll discuss the data on antioxidants, animal foods with you today, and how the way that we raise our livestock potentially impacts our health. This is my disclosure slide. Current research funding from USDA, NIFA, SARE, and ARS, as well as foundation research through Turner Institute of Eco-Agriculture, the Dixon Water Foundation, and NCBA. And below you'll also find my conflict of interest policy. So today's agenda is broken up into several smaller parts. First, I'll provide a little bit of a background on understanding the relationship amongst plant, animal, and human health, and why we believe there's a relationship and we're all interconnected. The second part, we'll look at the impact of grazing practices on potential health promoting phytochemicals in meat and milk. We're going to briefly look at some of the human health data, and as Jean alluded to, there is unfortunately a lack of it at the moment, so that won't be a long portion. And then we'll end up with a study that we recently published in Scientific Reports that compared meat, grass-fed beef particularly, with novel plant-based meat alternatives, which are both sometimes considered as healthier or potentially more environmentally sustainable sources of quote-unquote meat, though there are certainly nuances to that, which I'm sure we'll discuss today. So sort of zooming out first, using a bigger picture approach, there's a lot of concern about agriculture and its effect on the environment. And there's also a particular concern about red meat and dairy and animal source foods in particular on human health. Now, if we look at agriculture's environmental footprint, we use over a third of the Earth's land surface and 75% of the fresh water supply for crop and livestock. And I deliberately separated the two because we, in agriculture after the Green Revolution, really moved towards monocultures, where single monocultures of animals and typically monocultures of crop production as well. Now, we wrote about this recently in a paper where, and this is one of the things that we try to highlight, is monoculture versus biodiversity and its impacts on both agricultural and potentially human health. Now, it is clear that if we look at nature, there is no real monocultures in nature. That is something that's man-made. If you look into nature, there will always be plants and animals, and oftentimes a wide variety of plants and animals, in particular herbivores. So nature has introduced great biodiversity into ecosystems, but we as humans, for some reason, are always adamant on simplifying it to single species of crops and animals, and oftentimes also in separated production systems that, as a result, require considerable external fossil fuel inputs. Now, if you're looking on the left, a typical monoculture, one crop requiring considerable inputs, maybe there might be something like a soy and corn bean rotation, but typically a monoculture pastures. Whereas on the right, we're looking at an example of biodiverse, quote unquote, regenerative farm that can produce multiple crops and livestock products. Certainly, these decisions have to be made according to geographical scales and implemented where possible, but in typically some degree of biodiversity, even if it's within grazing systems, multiple plants can have potential benefits for soil and plant health. So regarding productivity and sustainability, simplified systems are typically productive in the short run, but they do make it difficult for farming systems to recycle nutrients and be sustainable in the long run. And that is really one of the main challenges that we have, according to several reports such as the FAO and the IPCC, is how can we maintain the sustainability in the long run, and how do we cut back on external inputs and improve the efficiency in the use of resources. So the 5 principles of sustainable food and agricultural production, according to the FAO, are indeed improving resources, conserving, protecting, and enhancing natural ecosystems. One thing we should also keep in mind is the economical aspect of this. For something to be sustainable, it also needs to be profitable. So it's protecting and improving rural livelihoods and equity. And then overall, of course, the resilience of people, communities, and ecosystems, and promoting good governance of both natural and human systems. So in other words, do practices that have potentially beneficial effects for for ecosystems also benefit us as humans, because ultimately we're also part of the ecosystem. One major issue is obviously our other dependence on fossil fuels and agriculture to produce foods. And this is a paper that came out in 2020, Economics for the Future Beyond the Superorganism. I highly recommend the paper. Besides having a ton of good information, it is also written very entertaining and oftentimes in a much different way as I would see papers being written in the nutrition field. So, but the short end of it, the author makes the point that to produce 1 calorie of food, it requires 2 calories of fossil fuels, the machinery to plant, harvest, and irrigate crops, to produce fertilizers and other agrochemicals to grow and protect these crops, as well as to produce antibiotics and other products to maintain the health of livestock. Now, we also require another 8 to 12 calorie equivalents of energy to process, package, and deliver and storage the food. And also waste food, which is also taken account into this. So can a species survive on 10 to 40 calories of energy to gain 1 calorie of energy? The obvious question would be probably not. So we need to make some changes moving forward. We talked about this in terms of, and it's sometimes referred to as regenerative agriculture, agroecological systems. It's basically linking plant, animal, and human health, and where possible, improving the nutrient cycles, as in the case of multi-species livestock systems or pasture-based systems with biodiversity on the land that provides potential wildlife habitat. Also with multi-species systems, there may be opportunities to integrate cattle with lamb or even chickens that can then use the larvae and forage residue as poultry feed. Where possible, with neighboring farms, there's a chance to graze crop residue, even within the same farm or neighboring farms, even in the case if there's some monocultures. Can also improve fertilization through the manure of the cow. And so these are ways of potentially coupling nutrient systems within agroecological farming. And we also have a particular interest in a lot of work that we do is systems type of research. So there's definitely a whole team of us working on this. My focus is really the human nutrition part, which we'll go into next. But do these agroecological farming systems, so in other words, environmentally beneficial production systems, also benefit our health and the nutrient density of the foods that we consume? Now, there's certainly an increased consumer and farmer interest in pasture-based meat and milk. The retail sales of US grass-fed beef have doubled every year since 2012. The global organic dairy market is also on the rise. And what a lot of farmers are referring to now, taking it perhaps one step beyond just being pasture-raised, is regenerative livestock farming, which are oftentimes termed or described as systems that aim to improve soil health, plant diversity, climate resilience, and also the health of communities. Now, if we link the production to human health, and but the data I'm going to present to you today is some of our initial data from a USDA SARE project. We're looking at regenerative farming systems, and oftentimes we hear this, especially in the farming communities, that healthy soils equals healthy plants, equals healthy animals, and equals healthy humans. Now, using the Metabolomics techniques, and I'll go into it, what that is in a little bit, we are looking at nutrient transfer along this continuum. So if we take soil samples and look at the metabolites and nutrients within the soil, the plant, the animal, and the human, do we see a relationship along this continuum where we see improvements in soil health, plant health, animal health, and potentially human health? So on-farm sample collection, the project that I'll present data from, we work with several pasture-based farmers. One of the things that we do, and here you can see Alan Franz-Lewers, one of the co-investigators collecting soil samples. So we collect soil samples from biodiverse pastures and neighboring cornfields. So the corn, obviously, we're going to the commodity market, used for ethanol. A lot of it ends up in livestock feed. And we're looking at a biodiverse pasture. So the soil is in the same geographical location, but here we're looking at do different management practices impact the health of the soils. Then we subsequently collect plant samples, so a total mixed ration sample, a pasture sample. We're also using UAVs to look at the diversity of the pasture, getting an aerial view. And last but not least, we collect meat samples, grain samples, and grass-fed beef samples. And we compare those using a technique called Metabolomics. So Metabolomics is really a technique where we take biological samples. These could be anything from soil samples, plant samples, food samples, but also human samples that are processed in a wet lab. We typically run them through a tandem mass spec and LC-MS/MS. So certainly depending on the compounds you're looking at, we might also use a GC-MS. We identify a wide variety of metabolites, and we do subsequent bioactivities and pathway analysis. So as you can imagine, you end up with 500 to 1,000 of metabolites, and we group these in specific classes such as phenols, terpenes, fatty acids, amino acids, which are all examples of metabolites. And then we overlay these metabolomes. So essentially we would overlay the forage metabolome, so the metabolites and nutrients in the forage that we find, with the meat, and then human samples, which are typically plasma or urine or stool. And we look at the metabolite or nutrient transfer along this continuum. And this technique is typically referred to as, specifically when we look at food, it's referred to as food metabolomics or foodomics. And it really goes beyond protein, vitamins, minerals, and fatty acids. So if we were to pick up a package of food, we typically see up to 13 nutrients appearing on those nutrition facts panels. So that is protein, carbohydrates, fat, and within that we might see sugar content, fiber content, saturated fat content, as well as a handful of vitamins and minerals. Now, foods are certainly much more complex than that. And even in the USDA food composition database, we only routinely track 150 components, and they form the understanding or the basis of our nutritional understanding and dietary guidelines and policies. But as alluded to, the food matrix, especially once we look at secondary metabolites such as polyphenols, terpenes, tocopherols, and other phytonutrients with potential health effects, or that certainly affect metabolism, we see that foods contain thousands, if not hundred thousands of metabolites. So in here, we're connecting the presence of these compounds in foods and dietary patterns with the human metabolome, and really studying how the biochemical complexity of these foods impact human health, as well as the nutri-genome, which is disease-related gene expression. And it allows us to do so in appreciation of the whole food matrix, rather than looking at single nutrients and associating that with human health, because obviously we do not consume nutrients, we consume foods. Now, what is a metabolite? Well, metabolites are small molecules that we either obtain from the breakdown of foods, drugs, chemicals, or even our own tissues. For instance, when we break down our adipose tissue or muscle tissue, we might generate amino acids. When we break down our adipose tissue, we generate fatty acids. Certainly, we get these compounds also from certain foods such as steak or cheese, which are sources of protein and several fatty acids. And we focus on plant secondary compounds, things like carotenoids and certain phenolic acids. We obtain those from plant foods, but certainly also we can obtain these from animal source foods. And what is particularly unique is that the animal, of course, consumes vegetation you and I cannot, which may provide an additional avenue, as we found out, that can improve the phytochemical richness of our diet. And that is really what we are focusing on now. The impact of livestock production systems on the phytochemical richness of meat and milk. Now, what are phytochemicals? Phytochemicals are plant-produced metabolites. Plants respond biochemically to sunlight, moisture, nutrients, other plants and herbivores by producing phytochemicals. And these can be thousands to hundreds of thousands of compounds. And we're really scratching the surface on this particular research and our understanding of how these compounds impact our health, but there is certainly research to suggest in vitro, so in petri dish models, in animal models, but also more recently in human models, to suggest that these phytochemicals are potentially anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, antioxidant, and brain protective at moderate doses, because we also know that at high doses, some of these can also become problematic. But at moderate doses, these can be anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, antioxidant to both the animal and potentially also to us. I'm just gonna throw it out there right away. Pasture grazing results in a higher meat and milk phytonutrient content. And we'll go into it later, into specifics. But what I do want to highlight is, and what is particular also in nutrition science, but in often fields of science, is that the golden rule is if you have thought about it, there's a good chance someone else has thought about it before you. Now, this data is from 1987 by Dwight Larrick et al., which was actually research conducted at NC State. Now, they looked at phytochemicals in more of a crude total measurement and parts per million per kilogram beef, and found that there's higher amounts in grass-fed beef that was on a monoculture fescue versus grain-fed animals, corn in particular, corn-based total mixed ration. More recent work out of Mexico, this actually is, also found that when this is done in goats cheese, when animals are on biodiverse pastures, in this case, they were consuming over 20 different species, the polyphenols, which is a class of phytochemicals, are higher in cheese particular, and appear to be much higher when compared to when the animals fed hay and concentrate. So here we see looking at the literature, an importance of biodiversity or plant diversity of the animal. And that is really what we were finding too in initial work. Pasture grazing accumulates phytochemicals in meat. So the phytochemicals that are in the forage get directly transferred into the meat and milk. And oftentimes, the phytochemicals are not often talked about in the context of grass-fed meat and milk. And one of the reasons being is that, I think, or in meat and milk in general, is that oftentimes you cannot even detect these compounds in animals that are fed or finished on concentrate, in this case in beef. And these are things such as terpenes, such as alpha-cubanine, beta-caryophyllene, trans-catenine 1,4-dianine, and they have all very difficult names, but these are all terpene compounds. And certainly they could have potential antiviral and anti-cancer effect, at least in vitro models, anti-inflammatory effects, antimicrobial effects. Now, we certainly must do more research in humans on this, because a lot of this is done in animal models and in vitro models, but there could be potential health benefits to ingesting these, and they're found exclusively or higher in grass-fed beef. Now, this is work that was done by another group from 2019, looking at several antioxidant phenolics, such as chlorogenic acid, ferulic acid, catechin. So chlorogenic acid is actually found widely in coffee. Catechin is believed to be an antioxidant that is responsible in part for the health effects of green tea. Now, as you can see, these are detectable when in the milk of goats on diversified pasture, but are indetectable when the animal is on total mixed ration, in this case 60% hay and 40% grain. Now, a question I often get is that, are these meaningful amounts? Well, in the interest of time, I don't have the slide on here, but when you actually compare the content, milligrams of catechin per 100 milliliters of milk, and compare that to some of the green teas, you can see that at least on the lower end of the green teas, diverse milk from animals on diversified pasture provides milligrams of catechin that are somewhat similar to those found in green tea. So certainly this is an interesting finding that we need to follow up more on, but there is certainly some evidence to suggest that these phytochemicals can also be provided in meaningful amounts in grass-fed meat and milk. Now, I certainly don't want to make the case that this negates the need to consume plant foods. Plant foods typically are 5 to 20-fold higher in phytochemicals, but what is particularly unique, and I think this is a key part, obviously herbivores consume plant species that you and I cannot consume, that are not consumed by humans simply because our guts cannot digest it. So this represents another dietary avenue by which complementary but also unique phytochemicals are ingested. For instance, some of the work has found things such as compounds such as alpha and beta pinene, which are named after pine trees. That's a common source, but they're also found in sagebrush. And they're studied for medicinal effects in certain plant essential oils, but they are also found in grass-fed meat and milk. And other examples there are also found to the left, alpha-copanine, alpha-beta-carophylline, which have possible livestock and human health benefits. And the wide variety of terpenes could have medicinal properties, both to the animal and potentially also to us, which is really what needs to be studied more. Now, this is some recent metabolomics data that I'd like to present on bison. So we also did these analyses in bison that were finished on a diverse mixture of plants, over 20 different plants, versus bison that were fed concentrate, which was a mixture of hay and grain. And if we look at the pathway here, and we already discovered some of these, like caffeic acid, again, found richly in coffee and as a metabolite of that ferulic acid. But if we look at here to the left, so plant phenolic compounds, they increase benzoate and also hyperate and catechol sulfate. Now, if we look at this pathway and then look at what we found using our metabolomics analysis, we find that hyperate is much higher when the bison are finished on grass versus when the bison are finished on grain. When we looked at, did a pathway analysis looking at benzoate metabolism, and if you refer back to the figure on the left, here also benzoate metabolism is involved in the metabolism of plant phenolic compounds. And we found several of these compounds in this pathway, so metabolites of plant phenolic compounds, to be in about 1 to 4-fold elevated in the grass-fed animals when compared to the grain-fed animals, again indicating that phenolic compounds are accumulated in this case bison meat. So from the previous slide, I showed you quinate. So this is quinic acid, higher in grass-fed beef versus grass-fed bison, I should say, versus concentrate-fed bison. Again, other compounds such as hydroxycinnamic acid that could have potential anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects for the animal, potentially also for us, higher. Sesamol, another compound found to be higher. And we really looked at about 600 to 700 metabolites and found that about half of them were differentially expressed in the grass-fed or grain-fed beef. And what is particularly found to be interesting is that looking at the metabolites of the meat gives us clues about animal health. So I'm originally trained as a human nutrition scientist, and certainly a lot of the work that I do is in the human nutrition realm. From human subjects, we get humans into my lab. These could be a variety of populations, people with metabolic disease, athletes, people with early signs of metabolic syndrome. And we take biopsies from them as well, small pieces of muscle. Now, with the meat metabolites, obviously, if we have meat from humans or meat from animals, we analyze those really in the same manner and look at, because we can see something about the metabolic health of the human based on their muscle. Now, can we do the same thing in the meat? What the figure illustrates here, if we look at this first, we see that glucose was elevated on the grain finished bison. We also look at various of these pathways like glycolytic pathways, as well as the TCA cycle. So the TCA cycle is related to mitochondrial metabolism. Mitochondria are really the powerhouse of our cells. They're elevated. These intermediates are typically elevated in endurance athletes that we see in our lab. Now, we see these intermediates also being elevated in the grass-fed animals. We also see early signs of glucose dysfunction, so glucose metabolic dysfunction in the grain-fed animals, and as well as higher glucose. So what we're actually seeing is, if we pull this back to your nutrition stuff, the animals finished on grain show a pre-diabetic metabolic syndrome phenotype that we typically see in humans, and the grass-fed finished animals show a phenotype that we typically see in athletes, in human athletes. So it's interesting to see that from these meat metabolites, we can give us clues about animal health. And certainly we need more data to link the two, but it is certainly interesting to ponder is that when the animal shows a sort of an athletic versus early signs of metabolic syndrome, how does that impact our health and our disease risk? Now, pulling it back to the older work again from Larrick in NC State, what he found is that when the animals are kept on total mixed ration in the feedlot, and this was done by harvesting animals routinely, first after 45 days, and it was after about 70 days, and then 120 days. What he found is that the phytochemicals are cut in half after 45 days on total mixed ration, and are further decreased, about threefold decreased after 120 days. So you see this decrease in the phytochemical richness when animals finished on feedlots, and more recently, this was also found in Italian work that was done on lambs. Now, there is a direct relationship between the phytochemicals in forage and those that found in meat and milk. If we look at the forage polyphenol content here on the x-axis, and look at the milk polyphenol content on the y-axis, all the way up here is grassland pasture. Grassland pasture contains some of the highest amounts of polyphenols, much higher than when that same grassland pasture is built into hay, or ryegrass hay or ryegrass silage. And corn total mixed ration contain the lowest polyphenol content of all studied forages, and subsequently also results in the lowest milk polyphenol content, whereas grassland pasture has the highest milk polyphenol content and also the highest forage polyphenol content. So there is a direct relationship between phytochemicals in forage and meat and milk. And while it intuitively makes sense, it is important that we consider this in the way that we raise livestock, and how that can impact the nutritional quality of our products. So this is sort of a summary slide that pulls it all together. And it basically finds that greater plant diversity results in a higher phytonutrient content. Now, grass-fed beef isn't grass-fed beef, isn't grass-fed beef. When animals are finished on plant species diverse pastures, which can have potential soil health benefits and biodiversity benefits also for the pasture, we see that this also translates into the most phytochemical rich meat and milk, with it being somewhat reduced on a monoculture pasture, and as I alluded to earlier in some of the data, lower or sometimes undetectable when animals are feedlot finished on concentrates. Certainly here, the importance is using local adaptation. So things such as biodiverse pasture seeding, cover crop grazing where possible, are all potential methods by which we can potentially increase the phytochemical richness of meat and milk. And certainly here, local adaptations are key. But what we're seeing is that we've taken comparisons of meat from North Dakota, from North Carolina, from Alabama, Idaho, and typically what we see is, pretty much irrespective of the geographical location, farmers that have biodiverse pastures and make it a priority to improve biodiversity on their farm typically ends up with the most phytochemically rich piece of meat. Certainly there will be subtle differences, depending on the plants that the animals are on, but typically, irrespective of the geographical location, we see that diversity benefits the phytochemicals in meat. The conclusions: foods contain thousands of biochemicals that are potentially capable of impacting human health. Several phytonutrients become concentrated in the meat and milk of animals, and typically, or at least I would argue they have been underappreciated historically in discussions of grass-fed meat and milk, which have predominantly centered around omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid. Certainly very important work also, but oftentimes I also hear is that, well, there's some difference in omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid, but other than that, there's not much nutritional differences between grass-fed meat and milk. Well, there are big nutritional differences, and just as big as you would expect in a human if they are consuming a Mediterranean diet or a standard American diet. We would expect large differences in what circulates in their tissues, and we see the same thing with animals, really. Several phytochemicals may have anti-inflammatory, antioxidant effects, but we certainly must further study their importance in grass-fed meat and milk in human nutrition trials. And this is, I think, a main part to take away is herbivores consume plant species otherwise not consumed by humans. So it represents another dietary avenue by which we can increase the overall amount as well as the variety of phytochemicals that we ingest. So we have ongoing nutritional studies, but I do want to look at some of the work that has been performed and what was found. So grass-fed meat and dairy has mostly been studied for the inflammatory response. So inflammation plays a central role in metabolic disease. It's rooted in most metabolic diseases, for instance, in coronary artery plaque, so cardiometabolic disease risk, but also so heart attack, stroke. But it's also thought to be a central role in cancer, diabetes, and arthritis. Now, every time we eat, we do have an inflammatory response. But if this inflammatory response to food becomes elevated and turns into low-grade systemic inflammation, that is when we run into trouble and we increase our risk of metabolic disease. Now, this is a study from Australia that is done 10 years ago that we're currently replicating with grass-fed and grain-fed beef that found that in the hours after the meal, the kangaroo meat, which was foraging on native pastures, versus the Wagyu beef, a very fatty piece of beef that is often finished for 300 days or even up to 500 days in a feedlot, that a marker of inflammation, in this case interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein, is elevated with the grain-fed Wagyu beef. Now, certainly we always have an inflammatory response every time after we eat, but we don't want this inflammatory response to be too dramatic. What the authors found is that the forage-fed kangaroo elicited a lower inflammatory response. Now, certainly, as you may will point out, rightfully so, what is the impact of forage versus the animal? Clearly, animal here is confounded, and even though the fat was cut off from the visible fat was cut off from the steaks, the beef steaks, the intramuscular fat must certainly have been higher compared to the kangaroo. Now, there's also been some long-term work done. This is work out of Italy that found that when Italians consumed half a pound of grass-fed pecorino, so that is cheese made from sheep, and not just any sheep, but sheep that are grazing biodiverse pastures in Sardinia, Italy. And we know that mountain pastures are amongst the most phytochemically rich pastures. What they found is that when the Italians consumed grass-fed pecorino for 10 weeks, their inflammation went down, and the placebo was just a grain-fed cheese. Work out of Texas A&M found no difference between grass-fed and grain-fed beef after 5 weeks, 4 5-ounce patties. A lot of this work, or none of this work, really linked it back to really providing any information on how the animal is raised. What we can gather from this work is that the cheese was from sheep on diversified pasture in Sardinia, Italy, presumably having access to maybe 50 to 100 different plants, and the grass-fed animals here were on a Bermuda monoculture pasture, and the grain-fed animals were fed a high oleic acid diet. So presumably maybe a little bit more favorable omega-3 to 6 ratio than you would typically get in feedlot beef. But as you can see here, monoculture and the grain-fed beef did not provide any differences. So Is the answer, is it the difference in diversified versus monoculture pasture? Certainly our data suggests that the diversified pasture has more phytochemicals than the monoculture, but also the time frame and the background diet. So these are, and like I said, none of these related back to grazing practices directly. So these are some of the work that we have ongoing, but as Jean talked about earlier, human nutrition studies take a while to complete. Now, research is sparse, but some studies show a potential for anti-inflammatory effects. There's also data, especially from the CLA and omega-3 data, that people can experience improved lipoprotein profiles or higher amounts of circulating omega-3 fatty acids in the blood when people consume pasture-raised meat and dairy, which is thought to be associated with a reduced risk of metabolic diseases such as diabetes and heart disease and cancer. Current knowledge does not allow for direct linking of livestock production practices. We need more human data, and that is really the key. We really need more human data on this topic. But what I do feel comfortable to say is that biodiverse pasture-raised meat and milk does look healthier on paper. Addressing this research gap, and this is really what I'm so excited about in the field for the last few years, there's much more collaborative efforts between farmers, agricultural scientists, as well as human nutrition scientists, because ultimately I think we all have the same goal, which is how to produce healthy, nourishing foods in ways that we can hopefully do sustainably, in a way that we can do it in 200 years from now still. Finally, I'll just go over this quickly, is a recent paper that we published. We compared novel plant-based meat alternatives with grass-fed beef, and to see if grass-fed beef is or plant-based meat alternatives are a viable replacement for beef, and of course vice versa. So similar nutrition labels, and these are the nutrition labels of the products that we studied. One of them is beef, the other one is a plant-based meat alternative. Now the question is which? As you can see from the labels, protein content is matched, fat content is matched, as well as several vitamins and minerals are fairly similar. Now, some of you probably picked up on this, but on the left we see ground beef, on the right we see the plant-based alternative. These vitamins and minerals are naturally occurring, and the plant-based meat alternative has added vitamins and minerals to more closely represent the nutritional facts panel of beef. Now, as we talked about earlier, these nutrients that appear on nutrition facts panels, these 13 nutrients, those are not indicative of the food matrix, which is very complex and contains hundreds or thousands of metabolites. So if you couldn't pick out the difference between the two right away, no worries, because 50% of consumers potentially view these as nutritionally interchangeable when presented with these nutrition facts panels. And they're also often marketed as such. And this is a popular quote from a CEO of one of the companies that once said, they're designed to meet, if not exceed, the nutritional profile of animal protein equivalents. Now, I'm not sure if we can say if they exceeded it, but we can potentially study whether they are different or not. So that is what we did. Sample acquisition, a plant-based meat alternative, a popular plant-based meat alternative, and beef. We cooked up the patties cooked them up identically, sampled the core using a biopsy needle, much like we do in humans, but we put it in a beef patty this time, and a plant-based patty. Processed the samples, run them to a GCMS, identified metabolites, did false discovery rate adjusted statistics and multivariate analysis, and did a bioactivity and pathway analysis to evaluate whether plant-based meat alternatives and meat are nutritionally interchangeable. Now, if you have no knowledge of metabolomics, then you can probably already gather from this figure is that there's no overlap between ground beef and a plant-based meat alternative. This is a principal component analysis. So what this analysis does is, after you've put all the metabolites, irrespective of the source, whether being plant or animal meat, you put them in a computer model, and the model figures out which samples cluster together. We see that the ground beef samples cluster together really well, and the plant-based meat samples cluster together really well, but they are also very much separated from each other. So if the beef and the plant-based meat alternative, so GB is grass-fed beef, PB is the plant-based alternative, so plant-based alternative beef. If we expect them to be nutritionally interchangeable, we expect them all to overlap. So the ground beef would be here, the plant-based beef meat would be here, and they would all overlap. And we could not distinguish between the two, but the lack of overlap illustrates that substantial differences exist. So, and this is a very big difference. Normally, we don't see these big differences when we study humans in dietary intervention trials. So we had a good chuckle in our Metabolomics core as well, because the differences are pretty much day and night. A novel plant-based meat alternative is not a one-to-one nutritional replacement when considering the whole food matrix. So these expanded pools of metabolites. This is a heat map of the top 50 metabolites. What we found is that we annotated 190 metabolites that we could name, and several hundred metabolites that we could not per se name, but were potentially different. But we found a 90% difference in metabolite abundance. Now, this does not mean that the ground beef was 90% more nutrient dense, or that the plant-based meat alternative was 90% more nutrition dense. We cannot determine from this data whether one is healthier to consume than another, but it's also beyond the point, because it is not an apples and oranges comparison. It is literally a meat from soy versus a meat from cow comparison. Here in green are the plant-based alternatives. In red is the ground beef. Blue means lower abundance of this metabolite, and here the blue means absence, and red means higher abundance. So if we look at several phenolic compounds, such as phenolic acid, sulfurol, phenylactic acid, which are common phenolic compounds found in soy, we can see that these are only detected in the plant-based alternative, which was soy-based. Then if we go down and look at certain antioxidants, such as allantoin, cysteamine, anserine, squalene, glucosamine, hypoxanthine, these were only found in the grass-fed beef and not in the plant-based meat alternative. We also found several medium-chain triglycerides, trilaurin, dicapron, which are typically found in coconut oil. That is not surprising, because one of the ingredients in the plant-based meat alternative is coconut oil. These were only found in the plant-based alternative, but not in the beef. So we found potentially health-promoting compounds in the plant-based alternative. We found potentially health-promoting compounds in the meat, but they are just not the same. So novel plant-based meat alternatives could be treated as alternatives in terms of sensory experience, but not as true meat replacements in terms of nutrition. Now, and this cannot or highlight enough. Data should not be interpreted either beef or plant-based meat is better. That's also beyond the point. They are different. Mimicking also what this data highlights is that attempting to mimic complex foods using isolated proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals really underestimates the nutritional complexity of whole foods in a natural state. In other words, you can make the nutrition facts panels look the same, but you have not replicated the whole food matrix. And that is so important. And I also think that we are often falling this trap of this plant versus animal discussion, which is really beyond the point, and we really need to move beyond that. We need to increase food production, potentially by 50 to 60% by 2050, and we must do so by improving both animal and plant foods. And the nutrients they provide should arguably be viewed as complementary rather than competitive in this scenario. And I think that is so important to know. And to bring it all back, what some farmers are definitely doing, or what we are hopefully doing more in these agroecological systems, is integrating biodiversity, and even where possible, sometimes integrated crop livestock systems. Now, this is really the bigger picture of it. You might wonder, what is a human nutrition scientist doing in the field of agriculture? Well, I only study a small portion of this, which is the human health aspect. That is really my bread and butter. But in this type of work, we're interested in linking the fields of food production, nutrition, and population health. And as Thelma and Clark put it so nicely in their Nature paper, diets really do link human and environmental health. And even a paper that came out recently in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition suggested that we look at diets both take into account human and environmental metrics. And really what we're interested in is, do agroecological, or sometimes referred to as regenerative practices, also benefit human health? Because ultimately, soil health, plant health, animal health, and human health, and together make up planetary health, are probably all interrelated. So by improving the health of soils, by improving and nourishing the plants and animals, we can nourish potentially ourselves. And that is questions we're trying to address. Without further ado, I'd like to acknowledge several individuals that made this work possible. As I said, none of this was done alone, but it's accomplished through interdisciplinary research, various collaborators throughout the US and even international. And with that, I would like to thank you all and open it up to any questions and discussions. And I'm very interested in hearing what you all think and any questions that you may have. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. That was really clear and really interesting. So, and very important. You know, just a reminder to everyone here, this is part of the Grassland 2.0 digital dialogue, digital discussion series. And if you haven't checked out the Grassland 2.0 project page, I just put the link in the chat. So this is really important research that Dr. Van Vliet has presented with us, because the Grassland 2.0 project seeks to understand how we could have agroecological transformation from the cropping systems, working with farmers to understand how they might make change into cropping systems that support water quality, soil health, deal with climate adaptation and mitigation, and then what the economics and the flows and the community and social interactions are with that system's change. And so having this really important and rigorous research on the human health connections to the animal health connections back to the crops and the grasslands is critical. So great. And we're going to open it up for questions here. I also would just remind folks that we have a series of these conversations, so please do get them into your calendar. I'm going to put the link for those in the chat also, but we're going to open it up for questions. I'm thinking that people can use the raise your hand function, or if you feel more comfortable typing a question into the chat, I'm happy to read that. And we have till 1:30, so we're good. We can have a good discussion. Okay, so Jean, do you want to unmute yourself and just ask your question?
Sure, we're a small group. First question was, when you're measuring the metabolites, are they only in the red meat, or are there also goodies in the fat component? So do we need lean beef, or is some level of fat okay?
Yeah, so it depends on the compound that you're looking at. Several benzoates and hydroxycinnamic acids, which is a major compounds of polyphenols. These might be water soluble, could be found in the lean portion, but also many of the terpenes and tocopherols, carotenoids, those are fat soluble. So certainly I would say that it's okay to consume some fat too. Yes, definitely a lot of these compounds are fat soluble, and they're certainly found in the fattier, the fat portion of the meat as well.
Great. Hey, would you mind stop your sharing, and then maybe we can see everybody?
Oh yes,
okay.
Sure. Sorry,
No, that's okay.
Actually see the questions now. Okay, let me let me see when it comes back. Let me stop the sharing. Okay, great.
Okay. Oh, but maybe okay. So Randy Jackson has his hand raised, so go for it, Randy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Van Vliet, for this wonderful presentation. Great information. As Sarah said, so clearly articulated. Really appreciate it. My question is kind of related to one that Gene put in the chat box, and that's related to pasture diversity, et cetera. And you make a strong point about something about the diversity seems to be leading to better phytochemical profiles, et cetera. And I guess I wonder if you all have explored whether it's just something related to the composition of the pastures specifically, like maybe a large clover content or something like that. And the reason I ask this is you may know that in the plant ecology world, people spend their careers arguing over, is it really the diversity effect or is it the composition effect? Is it really critical that there's a particular species in the mix? Is that something you all have explored at all or not really?
Yeah, we're exploring it now in our work. So the past few years, we have just looked at homogeneous, so a composite sample of the pasture. During the past grazing season, we have also been collecting a lot of individual plants to analyze, to see. I mean, certainly from as you highlighted, from the plant ecology literature, some plants are more phytochemically rich than others. All right, so it's probably, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. If you have a very diverse mixture of plants, but none of them are particularly very rich in phytochemicals, then maybe you see some diversity, but not very high amounts of these phytochemicals. But if you have also improved, have certain very phytochemically rich species of plants, then yeah, that would obviously increase the phytochemical richness of the meat. So my guess, my gut feeling tells me the answer is somewhere in the middle. The number of plants, I'm not 100% sure. And that's also is where it gets nuanced really quickly, right? If you have 4 very phytochemically rich species or 5 phytochemically rich species, then you may have a benefit over someone who has like 20 species. So, and the difficult part is that we can see what the animals have access to, but it is darn hard to find out what they actually ate too. So in field observations, and we use also in highlight today, we use DNA metabar coding of their stool samples to figure out the plant species in their stool, but that is also measured by protein. So the more protein-rich plants also, certain legumes or that contain higher protein content will also then be more predominant. So long story short is that, we don't know 100% yet, but that's certainly some of the things that we're trying to tease out some of these nuances now.
Great. And hey, Gene, I'm going to give the floor to Rick Adamski since you had your first question. So we'll go to Rick, farmer and thinker from up in the northeastern part of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dr. Van Vliet, for the very nice presentation. My question is, in the medical community, where is the study of phytochemicals? Is it regarded significantly? Is it considered secondary? Where is it in the medical area of research?
Yeah, I mean, in the medical area of research, you probably have a little bit of a ways to go, because we typically consider red meat to be unhealthy, right? Without for any further nuance, full stop. So that's also in the background diet is so important. Certainly in the nutrition field, phytochemicals are an emerging area of interest. Mostly been studied in petri dishes, so in cell lines, also in animal models. But what you typically see there is that phytochemicals in amounts that you would get that are through the diet, so realistic amounts, do impact disease risk, our brain health, and also our anti-inflammatory and antioxidant responses. So In the human nutrition data, and this is mostly been studied in the context of berries and maybe things like grape juice and other phytochemically rich fruits, is that what you see in that data is that it, in the hours afterwards, and even for up to 48 hours, it improves cerebral blood flow, it improves working memory, and this coincides with highest amounts of these metabolites in the plasma too. Also, we know a lot of these metabolites, these phytochemicals are metabolized by our gut bacteria. So at least in the human nutrition field, it does seem like these phytochemicals are impacting our health. They are impacting metabolism, and they are turning on and off genes that are related to disease processes. What we do not know is how the phytochemicals from meat or milk impact us as in regards to human health. So we know that there's differences in bioavailability in certain nutrients, whether they come from plants or animals. We don't know yet if some of these phytochemicals is there a difference in bioavailability if they come from the meat or the milk? Some of these unique compounds, can they impact us? So there is certainly an emerging area of interest. I think there's also, with regards to food metabolomics, there's an interest now in sort of figuring out the gray matter of food, all these other compounds that's beyond the vitamins, minerals, and proteins. So it is certainly a growing area of research, but I would be the first one to say that we need to further understand the importance of these compounds in human health. But initial research definitely suggests that they're impacting our metabolism and impacting disease-related gene expression, and at least can impact our cognitive function as well. So,
Thank you.
Dean, go ahead.
Sure. On your plant-based burger data, that the food factory is adding calcium and potassium and vitamins to the product. Even though we can measure them as comparable, are they equally absorbed in the human body? Are they metabolized by the person the same? Or do we have that data? Or maybe you talked it and I just didn't understand it.
yeah, no, so in this data, we didn't look at it specifically, but from other work, there's definitely data to suggest that, and it is a study that was done a few years ago. What the authors did was they fed people meat, and obviously from meat, beef, you would get zinc, iron, B12, and other bioavailable vitamins and minerals. What they did is that they replicated that meat matrix by providing these as isolated compounds. So isolated zinc, isolated iron, isolated B12 as supplements. What they found was if you give people the exact same amount of vitamins and minerals in supplemental form as that found in the beef, is that the beef had a greater improvement in iron and zinc status. So there's definitely the simplicity to the idea is that, we can just fortify or take supplements and that would end up in the same, get to the same endpoint. Yeah, that is nutritional reductionism. And because more from a mechanistic standpoint, we know that within the food matrix, there's hundreds to thousands of compounds that can interact with each other, that act as cofactors in the uptake. For instance, the tight connection between like zinc and copper metabolism, right? And so there's several cofactors that can impact the uptake of vitamins and minerals. And typically in the whole food matrix, we see an added benefit versus vitamins versus supplemental vitamins and minerals. So I would definitely think on a milligram or microgram to microgram comparison, then yes, the bioavailability from whole foods is typically higher, and that's why I think we should always focus on food first approach as much as possible when meeting our nutritional requirements.
Great. Julie Dahl, hello. You have a
Hello,
question.
Sarah. Good to
Hi.
see you. This was just wonderful. So my question is not very well articulated yet in my mind, but maybe you can help me figure it out. So This is so interesting. And I feel like consumers are already completely confused about what to buy with all of the choices and labels, let alone policymakers. I don't know, like, what do you see as some viable paths forward to help this be, these products be explained or marketed, or how can we like message this, or I don't know, just any thoughts along those lines would be great.
Yeah, no, it was very, very well articulated actually. So it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, sort of the broader picture of it is consumers are very confused. I agree with that. This week, eggs might be good for us. Next week, they might give us heart disease again. And the week after, they might give us diabetes. And then we figure out, oh no, they're healthy after all. Confusing for nutritional researchers and for policymakers, let alone consumers. A lot of it, that's a different discussion, but a lot of it boils down to the background diet, right? If we are to consume these eggs as egg McMuffins, it's going to be different than if you scrambled eggs with some peppers and onions in the morning. Also, the background diet in which these consume is so important. If we consume a healthy diet with a few eggs, no issue, right? If we consume ultra processed diet, then yes, the ultra processed foods, then it's an issue, and that's a huge problem. I think we need to do a better job at communicating that to consumers. Also, keep in mind the bigger picture. We need to look at this from dietary patterns. We're always thinking it's like, oh, food A contains saturated fat, and saturated fat is bad. So therefore, food A is bad. So we need to move away from single nutrients. We probably even need to move away from single foods to an extent, and really look at dietary patterns and look at it from that perspective, because that is so important. And the way that we communicate that to participants or to consumers too. Now, regarding the grass-fed beef or milk particular, yeah, this would also be highlighting to an extent, and that's consumer education, but that is saying like, hey, when animals have access to pasture, particularly are outside consuming a wide range of plants, this meat or milk may contain additional potentially health promoting nutrients. And I think that would be a way of like describing that for maybe like a farmer or direct to consumer marketing. And certainly want to be careful that we don't want to greenwash that and take it too far. But that might be a way of doing that. On the other hand, I'm thinking the last thing farmers need is probably maybe another expensive certification. But yeah, in that regard, it is connecting with, I'd say, like farmers that are doing these things, and as a farmer, I think also you have a very powerful role in this, right? Because you're able to are the earliest doctors, I guess, right? By the foods that you provide to humans, it's really the way that we can nourish humans, and I think that is also so important. So yeah, that is just I think engaging in conversation with consumers and putting this. It is complex, but putting these complex messages in a way that is simplified, but not too simple, because then we start to fall in this trap of saturated fat is bad, therefore we must avoid it like the plague.
I heard recently an acupuncturist who I really respect told me, Julie, just eat the rainbow of foods. And like, when it just kind of stuck in my head, right? Because it's really easy and simple. And then when you start to really think about it, there's not that many really healthy, just white foods, or and it's kind of similar. Maybe like we eat the rainbow foods, and then we want our animals that produce for us to eat a rainbow of foods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think definitely if you mostly focus on minimally processed foods, animal and plant foods, and limit our intake of packaged foods and ultra processed foods, then I think increase our fiber, fruits, vegetables, things like that. That for most of us, at least on a population-based level, we'd be improving our health. Like, getting there is easier said than done, I must admit that, with an overabundance of calories, energy-rich, nutrient-poor foods. But that is a discussion that we probably have for another couple of days and not figure it out. But also totally outside of my field. So, like, how do we get people actually healthier? But that's an interesting field by itself.
Okay, I'm gonna pass the floor to Thelma Heidelbaker. You want to ask a question? And then I'll get Eugene.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Oh, I'm really enjoying this whole discussion here and the topic of nutrition and thinking about, the diets of animals and things and the impacts to the products they produce. One of the things that I really appreciate what you were talking about with the comparisons with the like Beyond Meat and the plant-based alternatives, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about. There's a ton of interest in that. It's all over the marketplace. It's being discussed all the time. As somebody who produces grass-fed beef and does this, I think about it a lot because it's the direct, I don't know, and people compare it all the time, but yet at the same time, you're showing how different they are. So I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you is just in the information, the data that you were showing, and you were comparing how the plant-based versus the ground beef. Just as a clarification, was that ground beef grass-fed beef, or was that grain-fed?
It was.
And go ahead.
No, we'll go ahead if you had another question. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of along those lines, because if it is grass-fed, did you do a comparison with the grain-fed? Because you already showed how the differences are great between the grain-fed and grass-fed. And then, when they do these comparisons saying, oh, the plant-based alternative meats are so close to the other, if there's already these differences between those two types of beef, where does that fall on that assessment of the nutritional components of it?
Yeah, no, look, it's a great question. So it was grass-fed beef. Grass-fed beef from Diversified Pasture. Farmer's name is Glenn Alzinga. He raises cattle in Idaho, mountains of Idaho. And so that's definitely one of the critiques that we got on our paper. The reason why we compared it to grass-fed beef instead of grain-fed beef is because grass-fed beef and plant-based meat alternatives, they're both sometimes or oftentimes touted as more environmentally friendly and healthier. Right, that's often the messages that we hear. It gets more nuanced than that, but that's at least was our rationale. And they're also in the roughly similar price point, though I must admit that the plant-based meat alternatives are still more expensive than most grass-fed beef. So the reason that we compare to grass-fed beef is because consumers both would consider those to be environmentally more sustainable and healthier to consume. So we did that comparison because indeed, as you point out, we already had comparisons of grass-fed and grain-fed beef. But at the same time, and the study was also unfunded, so that's why we also didn't do that, because you have to pay it out of our own, like pull the funds together out of other ways to do that, which we also didn't want to get funded. We didn't want it to per se be funded by a beef or plant-based for that matter, just because it's such a hot topic. But I mean, in the end, I'm digressing. It didn't matter because if I have funding from the beef industry, so people would obviously think like, oh, this guy is tainted. But anyway, long story short, is that there will be additional differences. But these things like some of the compounds that we looked at, we didn't per se run a very deep phytochemical assay on that, but things such as taurine, anserine, creatine, carnosine, these are all bioactive compounds that are found in meat or in animal foods, I should say. Irrespective of whether it's grass-fed or grain-fed, these are compounds that are exclusively found in animal foods and not in plant foods. So even from that perspective, we were looking at it is that a lot of these differences would hold up irrespective of whether it was grass-fed or grain-fed, right? In these things, because even though there might be differences between grass-fed and grain-fed, the black and white difference that we showed on or found in the plant-based meat alternative and the beef and the grass-fed beef, that is in our grass-fed and grain-fed beef comparison. Yes, the plot is a little bit closer together, still differences, but this black and white like comparison, night and day comparison, that was something that we even sort of blew our hats off, because I did not expect to be like that big of a difference. But then if you think about it, it is as different as you expect a plant and animal to be, I guess.
Thank you.
Great. Gene, go for it.
Sure. Your conclusions in part 4 were, at least on paper, grass-fed beef appears to be healthier. Maybe if you could speculate, not that you would know an answer because we probably haven't done the work, but thinking about epigenetics and pre or perinatal nutrition of certain fetal developmental stages and the nutrition at that time, and potential for positive outcomes or protective, can we switch genetics on and off as a result of grass-fed beef with those phytochemicals?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Very good question. What we do know is that what you feed the fetus and then the young infant during pregnancy, especially the 3rd trimester and all, but also during the first 100 days of its life, it's going to set the child up for either a lifelong struggle with disease or certain protection of disease, right? So what you feed the child during that first 100 days, and also what the mother consumes during her pregnancy, is so important. So I would say that there's definitely a potential for that to be the case. But I also must be realistic, is that the real elephant in the room, obviously, is going to be diet quality. If someone eats a standard American diet, goes to a fast food chain every night for lunch or dinner, right? Eats pizzas and hamburgers at night, switching out a grain-fed patty with a grass-fed patty. I mean, that's like, that won't make a dent in it. On the other hand, if someone eats very healthy and maybe then, it's overall diet quality is so important. Well, let's take the example, for instance, if a mother is consuming a fairly healthy diet, but switches out all the animal source foods, the dairy, the eggs, pork, chicken, beef, all with pasture-raised versions, and then we're probably making we could be making a big enough difference in the diet that maybe that would impact things. But I think none of this can be decoupled from diet quality. So, but it's certainly very interesting, and it could be possible because you do see it in human nutrition intervention trials, is that at least acutely, phytochemically rich foods, and again, this hasn't been studied in the context of the meat and milk per se, but the phytochemically rich foods, it turns on certain genes on and off in the 48 hours after consumption. So there's clearly something going on. It's clearly impacting metabolism. So I would definitely not, I would, if I were to speculate, I think it would matter. I just don't know how much.
Great. Randy, go ahead. Oh, David.
Oh,
Okay.
let David get in, or somebody else.
Go for it, David.
Hi, I have to unmute myself. Good afternoon. Hi, how are you? Sorry, I missed most of it due to a conflict, but I've heard you speak a couple times, I guess. I'm really curious, to see your affiliation with the medical school and coming from a nutrition background, and I think kinesiology is part of it as well. And knowing some, not all the people here were usually coming from natural resource schools or from environmental backgrounds, agronomy, ecology. Where do you see these two worlds beginning to intersect, from whether an academic perspective or a policy perspective, whether we have Health and Human Services and CDC and NIH on one side and USDA over here, or whether we have the ag school and the med school are these two silos that are usually so far apart. And I think this work in particular, and some of the work that we've been doing also, is starting to show that they're not actually that different, and they really need to be focusing on together. And I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are on how to do that now that we've at least identified that we're talking about two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, David. Great to see you. And it was, I don't want to get too far on my soapbox here, but the fact that we're in the medical school mostly studying diseases of dietary origin, treating it at the back end with pharmaceuticals, and pay no attention to agricultural schools. Yeah, that is mind-blowing. That is really, really mind-blowing. Now, I do think that times are changing in a bit. Is that, like, how can we stimulate that? Well, that is by having the NIH and the USDA fund this type of research, this systems type of research. And there certainly are more calls to do that. But it is certainly not the norm yet either to engage in this systems type of research. But yeah, I think it's so important because farmers, ecologists, agronomists, livestock scientists, we all have sort of the same idea in mind, is that how can we produce foods as sustainably possible, and how can we do it that improves our health? And the two are probably also very much related, right? Like if we start to improve soil health, plant health, animal health, we probably also improve human health. And I think you wrote an excellent white paper on this recently that I came across. Yes, that's right. Which I enjoyed very much reading, to linking these. And indeed, as you also point out, is that we're very much in the infancy of it, but it does seem like it's heading in the direction. We are moving up in that direction, certainly not moving down, if anything. So long way to go. Baby steps, as always, in science and policy. But yeah, all we can do is get different players involved. And also important, the food industry, right? Like players that without support from industry, as it has been pros and cons working with industry, but without industry, we're not going to get very far either, which is why I think it's great that some of the bigger companies are moving into this space. And certainly, of course, they are seeing this from also, we can make profit on this, but if it means they do the right thing in the meantime, then yeah, I'm all for it. So it's just getting multiple players involved, and yeah, just keep pushing forward, I guess. That's the goal.
Great. Oh yeah, David, thanks for putting the link in there. Julie.
I just wanted to follow up with a comment. This week, I had a conversation with a friend who is a social worker. She's a therapist, and she said she has been trained on the link between nutrition and mental health. She said it's so not talked about, right? But just these deficiencies in our current food have really dropped our serotonin levels. And, you know, she works with her people to like talk about amino acid supplements and like good diets, because amino acids from proteins go right, you know, go directly into serotonin and serotonin production. So it just was fascinating to hear about that. And, you know, you think about like what we're feeding our kids and what we feed in prisons and hospitals. And it's like, how can you get better physically, let alone mentally, on so much of that?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And it's definitely I mean, I don't have the numbers, but when we recruited subjects maybe like 8-10 years ago, we always had an exclusion criteria, especially for middle-aged and older adults, is antidepressants. You know, if I do that today, then I have to kick out, I could barely, you know, recruit a subject, research participants sometimes, and or certain drugs is that you have to have exclusion criteria. It's weird. Like people are over certain ages, yeah, just prescribing drugs, I guess. But yeah, we should really. That's again dealing with the symptom, or sort of like a prescription path approach to health, rather than which is important too, but it should be a short-term solution. And the long-term solution should be changing your lifestyle. What is the reason that you are in this? And yeah, it is so hard, because a lot of times it's not even, you know, that an individual is lazy or whatever, right? It's like it needs to come from like bigger policy. The reason people have metabolic disease, mental health, is not just because they're even their fault, to, you know, or don't have willpower. I mean, it's really this constant bombarding of being directed, nudged into like a stressful life, energy rich, nutrient poor foods, and that sort of impact our flavor feedback responses, and tend to overeat and things like that. We see this in a trial we do now. We have matched for foods, ultra processed versus minimally processed, and it is almost impossible to keep people from overeating. And so it cannot even be decoupled from that, because eating some strawberries, you get the flavor, but you also get the nutrients. eating a strawberry gusher, you get the flavor, but you don't get the nutrients. So you probably end up overeating because you don't get the normal neural feedback responses. And so, yeah, it's definitely a super complicated avenue of work. But I 100% agree that we underestimate the role of food in there. Absolutely. Which we historically seen as energy and just like, getting your nutrients in, but not really viewing it as a pathway to health as much as we should, I think.
Thanks. Randy, you had your hand up before and I shooed you away.
Well, I guess my question was going to be a little bit sort of related to what we've been talking about, but it was a little more cynical, let's say. I'm wondering, Stephan, are there folks out there that are doing research that is the opposite of what you're finding, that are generating results showing that, there aren't really differences? And I'm just trying to understand the landscape out there. Like, is there a real antagonism there, or?
You mean in regards to the phytochemicals?
Yeah, phytochemicals, and then just more broadly, with grass-fed compared to other types of foods.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is research on that, and I think, yeah, it depends on the interpretation here. Is that there's differences between omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid in grass-fed versus grain-fed. There's typically no difference in protein, typically no differences in zinc, iron, certain vitamins. Some work showed a difference in thiamine and riboflavin, Susan Duckett's lab out of Clemson, but that was, not everyone has found that. So typically based on this sort of like this handful of nutrients, you say there's no differences, and the omega-3s are so low that it doesn't matter, right? We compare to salmon.
So the pushback might be like the coarse stuff, the big stuff, not really that different. You got to really dig down and get at the fine tuning to find the differences. Am I articulating that right?
That's right. And then people are like, well, I mean, how much does it matter really? And yeah, I mean, the literature itself, like this has been heavily studied in particularly in Italy and France. They study these phytochemicals, but they came out from a food science perspective, because they look at the phytochemicals as flavor compounds, and flavor and health is related, right? How do we get our cheese to taste great? I'm sitting there looking as a human nutrition scientist, and I'm like, wait a minute, these are compounds that also have health benefits. So the two are probably related. So we're definitely not the only ones finding that. And in fact, we're not even the ones who are credited with this, making this up. As I said, the golden rule of science is, if you can think of it, someone else has thought of it way before you did, just using less sophisticated techniques. So I would say phytochemical difference is fairly well established. Question is, how much does it matter? And the pushback mostly on this is not so much the diet or the data. The same with the plant-based meat alternatives. The pushback is not so much on the data. The pushback is on this, like, what does it matter really? How important is this? And yeah, that I don't know yet. And also, again, this nuance of diet quality is so important. I mean, we must also be realistic. The reason we have an epidemic of metabolic disease in the US is not because most of us are eating grain-fed beef, right? We must be that realistic. It is the overall diet that matters.
Yeah.
And then will it make a difference? Yeah, sure. And I think it will, but we must also not lose sight of the bigger picture, which is the fact that we eat 2/3 of our foods from ultra-processed junk.
What you said about the literature reminds me that my former grad student, David Duncan, in his dissertation defense, was asked something about the literature, and he said, well, the literature is like the city at night. You can find whatever you want if you go looking for it.
Yeah, that's true. And that's true. And even with some of the modeling approaches, how you do it, you have like these nutrient density scores, depending on the model that you throw, and you can make liver look the healthiest, or you can make kale look the healthiest, right? It was a paper that came out a few days ago in Nature Food that found that Cheerios and Fruit Loops are much healthier than unprocessed cheese and beef.
Oh, good.
So it's yeah, those are apparently chocolate covered almonds are health foods and Fruit Loops, but cheese and beef are not. But other metrics might show like, hey, you know, liver, beef amongst the most nutrient-dense foods. So these score high, whereas the Fruit Loops maybe score a little bit lower, which probably is where I would think they should score. Yeah, so it like you said it really well, Randy. Depending on what you go looking for, you can find it. But yeah, then it's also just asking people, even in research, I think it's so important to ask people that the paper on plant-based meat alternatives, I sent it to a few people that are on plant-based diets. And I'm like, what do you think of this? I don't want this to sound like I am anti plant-based or vegan or anything, you know, and I really want to make that look clear because we all eat. So that's so important. So I think it's in part, it is our responsibility to not fall into dogmatic traps and keep our eyes open. But yeah, sometimes if you do research for a long time, then you might actually believe that your way is the only way, right? So we have to be careful for that. Maybe I'm wrong about all of this, and in 10 years I have to. But I'm saying we always must be keep an open mind, right? So that's the point I'm trying to make.
Great. Well, I see we're up against time. I do want to invite people to, before we say thank you, I want to make sure that we know that Thelma Heidelbaker is our next guest speaker in the series, and she is coming up on the, let me get it in front of me, the 16th of November at noon Central, and she will be talking about benefits of grazing to birds, bees, family, and farm. So I just want to make sure that people know that. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and especially thank Dr. Van Vliet for being here and sharing his super important research.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Great discussion.
Cool. Well, good. Well, I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.